to NFL Live coming out of Cincinnati, and as has been expected, with 24 hours to go before the tag deadline, wide receiver T. Higgins has been tagged for the second year in a row. He is just the second wide receiver to be franchised twice by the same team. The other was Chris Godwin, who signed a long-term deal with Tampa shortly after he was tagged a few years ago. And this was T. Higgins' response. Quite simply, tag. Adam Schefter joins us now. Adam, what more can you tell us?
Hannah, this was the expected outcome in the T. Higgins situation that still is unfolding as we speak. I don't think we've heard anything close to the last of the T. Higgins situation, but this marks the second straight year that the Bengals have used their franchise tag on T. Higgins to take him really out of unrestricted free agency. It's a $26.2 million franchise tag, and the Bengals were quick to point out that their intent is to work towards a long-term deal. Now, my understanding is the two sides at this time are not close to a long-term deal. On the open market, T. Higgins would command north of $30 million a year. The franchise tag number right now is 26.2. So clearly there is work to be done between the two sides, and were he to hit the open market, there would be a team that would be paying him $30+ million a year. But the Bengals right now are not willing to do that. So we'll see if the two sides can figure out their differences, but this is one of any number of issues the Bengals had this offseason. They still want to get a deal worked out with Jamar Chase, but the focus for now is on T. Higgins. They still have to deal with Trey Hendrickson, who led the league in sacks last year and wants a new deal. Plenty of financial issues in Cincinnati, but they have now placed the franchise tag on T. Higgins.
So they have taken the first step as Dan Orlovsky and Mina Kimes join us now. Dan, let me start with you. What are your thoughts about this move?
Makes sense. I just don't know how it's going to end, and that's going to be the fascinating part. And Shefty knows a little bit more than me, but to my mind, it's like one of three things can really happen. Number one, that T. Higgins plays on that franchise tag and signs it. I just feel like that's unlikely. Number two, this gives them more time in Cincinnati with T to get out a long-term deal that gets signed. Or three, and I want to see if this is when it gets really interesting, is does it be a opportunity or become an opportunity where they trade him and now he just doesn't walk out of their building, but they can use that franchise tag as a way to give a team an opportunity to put together a package that they want to use to trade for T. Higgins and then sign him, because I just don't see how Cincinnati can sign T. Higgins, Trey Hendrickson, and Jamar Chase and field any type of competitive football team moving forward.
Yeah, especially because, Dan, all of the needs they have on defense. I mean, I was just looking at the roster trying to figure out what positions they should target in the draft. Every position is one that they have to get better at on defense, right? Defensive tackle, edge, opposite Hendrickson, linebacker, cornerback, safety. They all have needs. So if they were to try to get a deal done with Higgins, and I understand the impetus given how successful they've been in offense, they would have to have the draft of their lives in Cincinnati to get better on that side of the ball. As far as the tag and trade option goes, I agree with Dan. I'm interested in seeing if there's any reports of interest in the next few days or the coming week or so, because there's great need on a number of teams that have a lot of cap space. And with Higgins off the market, if Chris Godwin were to stay in Tampa, it's not a great group of receivers. And Dan and I were talking about this too. It's not a particularly great receiver draft. So if I'm a team like the Patriots, the Commanders, the Chargers, I'm calling and seeing if it's a possibility. I'm not saying it's going to get done, but I'm just calling to see if there's a possibility.
And Mina, I think that's exactly what is going to be going on across the league right now. Again, the Bengals have not advertised their intentions other than trying to get a long-term deal worked out with T. Higgins, which is what they should be saying, because number one, they should want the player. But if they can't get a deal done, then they should be looking to deal T. Higgins. And there are people across the league who believe that this could wind up being a tag and trade. Now, we don't know whether that will happen, but I can tell you that there are people around the league who believe a tag and trade is possible here with T. Higgins, despite the fact that the Bengals have said their intent is to sign him to a long-term deal.
The timing of all this is so fascinating, though, because with free agency a week away, essentially, in the NFL, Jamar Chase and Trey Hendrickson are going to have, obviously, markets. And so you can't wait that long to figure out the potential trade partners if you're Cincinnati and the likelihood of that long-term deal getting done, because you can't allow those other two guys to potentially hit the market. And I think the priority for Cincinnati has to be Jamar Chase, Trey Hendrickson, and then T. Higgins, as much as I love T. Higgins. So the timing's fascinating. The other part is this. T has a very specific body frame and role. And so if they come to a point where we're not going to get a deal done with T. Higgins, one, you have to get draft capital for this year. I don't care about draft capital in the future, this year. And then two, they got to really go after and find a receiver that does replace a little bit of that body frame that T has because of the style that Joe has in throwing guys open. You're looking at a 6'3", 6'4", 6'5" type of receiver to try to replicate how big of a productive player T. Higgins has become.
Much more to come on this story. Much more work for the Bengals. We should mention they also released guard Alex Kappa today, and in doing so, they saved $17.6 million in cap space. All right, big news over the weekend. Deebo Samuel traded from the Niners to the Washington Commanders for a 5th-round pick. The deal becomes finalized March 12th. That's the start of the new league year that Dan just referenced. And here is what Deebo brings to D.C. He is a yards after the catch aficionado. Deebo averaged over 8 yards of yak per catch last year, the highest among wide receivers, and that just so happens to be a weakness for the Commanders. Washington ranking no higher than 21st in the NFL in yards after the catch per reception last season. So we have another weapon for Jaden Daniels. Adam, what more can you tell us about this trade and how it got done?
Listen, Deebo Samuel and Kyle Shanahan talked during Deebo's exit meeting at the end of the year, and I think both sides recognized the fact that they would be moving on from one another. Deebo requested a trade. He was allowed to seek permission to go seek a trade partner. There were a few teams that expressed varying degrees of interest in Deebo Samuel. The Houston Texans checked into it. The Denver Broncos checked into it. But the one team that really stayed on it was the Washington Commanders. The Washington Commanders general manager is Adam Peters, who came over from San Francisco. And it's interesting because the Commanders always had wondered whether or not it'd be worth adding Brandon Ayuk to team up with Jaden Daniels, being that they played together at Arizona State. But in the end, they do go for a 49ers wide receiver, but it turns out to be Deebo Samuel, somebody that can complement Terry McLaurin,